Thanks very much. I'm outnumbered today, all right. One consultant, I think. So just the presentation today is on accessibility, Part M 2010 and universal design in practice. So what I'd like to do is focus in on the bullet point about where accessibility can go wrong. So just to kind of dive into the detail of where things go wrong at design stage, but also during construction of projects. And just to kind of flag some of the issues that you have, but just to set the context, highlight some of the barriers faced by people with disabilities, highlight that there are other pieces of legislation that impact on accessibility in Ireland, a brief overview about universal design, and also just to give some examples of where we can look at universal design in the built environment beyond meeting the, I suppose, beyond the information that's provided in the technical guidance document. The application of Part M 2010 has been kind of covered in detail, so I'll skip over some of the slides in that area as well. So I suppose just to set the context, the barriers faced by people with disabilities come in many forms. I know we're focusing today on the built environment and I suppose making buildings accessible, but I suppose one of the first barriers people with disabilities face is access to information. So, for example, if someone was going to a gallery, they might want to, they'd like to plan their journey in advance. They might go on the website and try and find out about all the accessibility features that are in place within buildings and so on. So that would be good practice for people. But also, I suppose, the lack of information can create a major barrier for people with disabilities. The lack of accessible public transport. So even though we've had legislation in Ireland since 2005 to make public transport more accessible, there are still major issues, whether it's using the lifts in the train stations or hearing enhancement systems on board a bus and so on. The built environment we cover in detail. Access to services. So again, it's whether someone's going into a local authority and maybe accessing a library service or trying to pay their motor tax. The whole aspect of people's attitudes and customer services can really impact on how someone avails of a service and can be a barrier to accessibility. And then we have the area of inclusive workplaces or employment. So I suppose just to highlight that it's quite challenging even in 2023 for people with disabilities to gain access to employment. Some of the other images on the screen there include access to housing. So again, we're starting to see in Ireland now where county development plans are looking at areas of universal design homes and specifying percentages of houses that need to be accessible. But up until recently, that hasn't been the case, and access to housing has been a major challenge for people with disabilities. So that's just setting the context. If you did a simple little case study there about accessibility to the gallery, we might be just thinking about the built environment, but it's about the importance of pre-visitor information, having good customer services, having accessible information provision. So, for example, having access maps or access guides, but also having things like audio guides that are available for people with hearing impairments, making sure events within the gallery are fully accessible and so on. So if we want to take a holistic approach to accessibility, we're looking at all of those key areas and so on. Okay. So the other, just briefly on the legislation, and I could spend the whole time just speaking about legislation, but I suppose today we're looking at the access to buildings, and we're looking at the Building Control Act, we're looking at building control regs, we're looking at building regulations and technical guidance and so on. But I suppose there are other areas of legislation around access to employment and access to services that we just also need to be aware of. It's already been mentioned about the Safety, Health and Welfare at Work Act. There is a regulation called Regulation 25 that specifically requires that workplaces are made accessible to meet the needs of people with disabilities. So, for example, if someone in your workplace acquired a disability, you have an obligation under Regulation 25 of the 2007 regs to make your workplaces accessible. You also have an obligation under employment legislation to reasonably accommodate. So both private and public companies have an obligation to reasonably accommodate people with disabilities in all aspects of the employment process. And then if we look over at the access to services, so for example, as I said, someone could be going to a leisure centre, they could be going to a restaurant, a hotel, or they could be looking at going to the library and stuff like that. We have a few pieces of legislation there. We've got the Equal Status Act and the Disability Act of 2005. Equal Status Act applies to both the public and private sector. It requires that you must reasonably accommodate people with disabilities in the provision of goods and services that you provide. So, for example, a recent case taken by someone where they were refused entry into a hotel. They had a guide dog with them, and the receptionist refused entry. They took a case against the hotel, and the hotel was fined, I think, €6,000, and all their staff to undergo training. So I suppose just to be aware that it's not just about the built environment; it's also about the services that are being provided within the building, and you cannot discriminate against people with disabilities in the provision of those services. The Disability Act 2005 was mentioned already, and it was already Eoin mentioned that about the National Disability Authority developing a code of practice in relation to Section 25 of the Disability Act. So there's an onus on public bodies such as yourselves, the local authorities, that the public areas of your buildings need to be kept in line with the requirements of Part M. So keep an eye on the code of practice that's coming out. It sets obligations on you to make sure that the public areas of your public buildings are made accessible to meet the needs of people with disabilities. So that's just a quick overview of the legislation. We also mentioned universal design, and universal design is referenced in technical guidance documents in page 9 or 10 of the TGD M. It's also written into Irish policy under the Disability Act, and it's written in the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. If we look at the second bullet point, it refers to the design and composition of an environment so that it can be accessed, understood, and used to the greatest extent possible by all people, regardless of their age, size, or disability. So universal design is about designing products, services, the built environment, and information and communication technology to cater for as many people as possible. So simple example of universal design, OXO, who developed products like your potato peeler or your measuring jug and things like that. The image on the screen there is basically saying no one size hand fits all. So, everyone's got a different size hand, a different shape, different strength, grips and stuff like that. So OXO recognized that, and they've decided that all their products that they develop, they want to cater for as many people as possible. So they're taking a universal design approach to developing the product. That's why your potato peeler has got an easy to grip, pressure absorbed handle and stuff like that. Or that's why the measuring jug has inside in the jug at 45 degrees, they have the measurements inside the jug, so you can stand up, pour the water without having it up to your face and so on. Okay, so that's just a simple example of universal design, and I suppose just to strengthen that in relation to the built environment, we've been quite fortunate in our company that we've had a number of projects where our clients have come to us and said, look, we want to design our offices or our facilities to be fully accessible and to take a universal design approach. So we've developed in-house checklists around the area of universal design. We've looked at things like multi-faith prayer facilities and put them into the buildings, design them in. We've looked at family mother and baby changing facilities. We've been looking at the accessible changing places toilets, which has now come into the regulations for the past few years, and we've incorporated those into our designs. We've looked at things like scooter charging points in the main reception, so that if someone comes on a mobility scooter, that they can charge it while they're using their building. And we've also looked at things like sensory rooms or sensory rooms or quiet areas to address things like neurodiversity within the workplace and so on. So I suppose it's just to be mindful here that when we're talking about universal design, there may be elements in the design of a building that aren't covered in the technical guidance documents, so that in relation to that universal design approach for building design. So if anyone wants any more information on that afterwards, just let me know, and I'll be happy to share it with you. So the Part M 2010, and as we're aware, we now have a Part M 2022, which will be coming into force, into operation from early next year. So I suppose we've all seen the requirements of the regulations that are currently M1 to M4. I always try to emphasize to people that the regulation, the Part M 2000 used to be referenced to people with disabilities. It's now referencing people, and it's all people regardless of their age, their size, or their disability. So that's an important one there. And M2 and M3 relate to an extensions of a building. The next slide has been covered, I suppose. What type of works does Part M apply to? It applies to new buildings and new dwellings, extensions, material alterations, and as Eoin has mentioned, certain material changes of use. And it's clearly set out in section 06A to 06D of the technical guidance on how you apply Part M for the different types of works that you're doing. And I think Eoin gave a comprehensive summary of that earlier on as well. As you're all aware, the technical guidance document is broken into four main parts. As Martin has referenced earlier on, whether it's a new or existing building, you always must try and achieve the guidelines in Section 1 of TGD M. However, it may not be practicable in all situations to meet the guidance in Section 1 for existing buildings, and there's a less onerous set of guidelines in Section 2 of the technical guidance document. Section 3 is access and use of dwellings, and as Conor mentioned earlier on, it's making the dwellings visitable. So someone can come to your house, they can have a cup of tea and they can use a downstairs toilet. It doesn't mean that if your brother or your sister or your parent acquires a disability that they can come and live in your house and so on. So I think that's just an important distinction there. I always say to people, the first 15 pages tell a lot in the technical guidance document. So it's really important that you've a good understanding of those first 15 pages. Everything after that is a list of the 350 bullet points that Martin mentioned around the width of the stairs or the height of a handrail and so on. So it's really important to get a good understanding of the first 15 pages, particularly things like determination of practicability or looking at existing buildings and historic buildings, which will be covered in the afternoon section under Section 08 and so on. So that's just a quick slide showing the use of the guidelines and application of Part M. And I suppose just to reference there, Section 1 applies to both new and existing buildings. And as I said, it may not be practicable in all situations to use the guidelines in Section 1. So there's other guidance provided in Section 2 of TGD M as well. So again, that's covered in detail under Section 0.5 of the guidance. So I suppose looking at where does accessibility go wrong, and this is more just, I just want to give you some examples of where things can go wrong in different projects that we've been working on. And I suppose there's a kind of a hit list that you can nearly always guarantee that will go wrong unless you catch it early in the design or tender or specification reviews and stuff like that. So what I'd like to do now is just kind of go through Section 1.1 to 1.6 of the guidance, and just to highlight different areas, things that can go wrong, whether it's on site or whether it's during design and so on. So you're all aware that it's a logical sequence. Section 1, it's approach to buildings other than dwellings. Then you look at access, which is the entrances. You look at circulation, which includes horizontal and vertical circulation. There's a section on sanitary facilities, other facilities in buildings, and then we look at aids to communication, which covers things like signage and lighting and wayfinding and hearing enhancements and so on. So if we dive into Section 1.1 of TGD M, and I just put a few photographs or examples up on the screen as well, but things that can go wrong in projects. So typically, for example, on the design of a stepped access route, people will forget to make sure that the corduroy tactile warnings contrast from the surrounding paving and things like that. And no matter how much detail you put on a drawing, so this, the tactile warning needs to be 400 from the top or the bottom step, the subcontractor or the contractor will always put it in the wrong place. So it's important that things like visual contrasting nosings are provided, and that you've got the correct light reflecting values and stuff like that. So typically when people are putting in steps, they're rushing to finish the job, and they're putting putting stuff in the wrong place. In relation to ramped access routes, then things like, and this is an example of a ramped access route here, you need to have a curb edge of 100 millimeter height, and the curb edge needs to visually contrast from the surrounding. It should also run the full length of the slope and stuff like that. So handrails, again, you can see in the examples here, the handrails are in the wrong position, but also the handrails need to extend 300 millimeters from the top and bottom of the stairs. The main reason for that is to allow people to balance themselves, but also if someone is weak on one side, they can pull themselves up the steps and things like that. Here again, another similar to Martin's example, the importance of glazed manifestations, and glazed manifestations need to be located at dual heights, but they also need to contrast visually in all lighting conditions. And 99 times out of 100, people will just put those 50 mil frosted circles on the glass, and they won't contrast in all lighting conditions, particularly if you've different color painted colors behind the area. So it's really important that when you are specifying the glaze manifestations, that they contrast in all lighting conditions. Things like thresholds. So again, here's an example of an accessible entrance which had a 75 mil level change, which was supposed to be an accessible entrance and so on. Okay. You then look at things like car parking. So in the example here on the top right, the car parking should be on a surface which is level. A level surface is a gradient of 1:50 or less steep. And again, just to bear in mind that some people may have wheelchairs where they don't have any brakes, so they it's important that it is on a level surface. The second example there is of a car parking bay, and again, you don't have the hatched area on all sides, but also I'm standing up at the top here where the photograph's been taken. So it's going to be very difficult for someone with reduced mobility to get up to this point to get into the building and so on. So again, back to the provision and the location. So I always say to people, think about the provision, the location and the design when you're looking at kind of assessing your applications, but also out on site. One thing that we find that goes wrong all the time is the actual laying out of tactile paving at crossing points. So you're aware that you have a buff or a red color depending on the type of crossing that you may have, but also you use blisters for pedestrian crossings and you use corduroy for from the top and bottom of steps. The problem that you have on site is that the blisters need to match up or line up with the crossing on the far side. But again, if the contractor is not aware of that, they'll just lay out the crossings incorrectly and stuff like that. So it's something we look at a lot in our drawings and stuff like that when we're reviewing specifications, but it's also something that we advise the contractor to be very careful with when they're laying out the paving and so on. In relation to car parking, it does say that the accessible car parking bays should be the closest space to the accessible entrance. So watch out for that when you're assessing your applications. And also when you're looking at basement car parks, there is a requirement that the clear headroom should be at least 2.6 meter from the entrance to from the entrance to the basement car park down to the accessible bays themselves. And often something people forget about is that in section 1.1.6 of TGD M, it states that if there's a road leading to a building, you must provide a set down area. So set down areas need to be provided where there's a road leading to the building. Other things like slope access routes where your half landings need to be correctly designed and need to be a level surface of 1:50 or less steep, and things like surface finishes need to be slip resistance in accordance with the British standard and so on. One thing I should mention there, the LGMA have guidelines around pedestrian crossings and the layouts and stuff like that, so that's available for you as well. That's just an example of a car parking, an underground car park where they didn't provide the 2.6 meters and they provided a sign to indicate where the closest accessible bays are. Also on car parking, just to make sure that you provide the dish curbs at the top of the bay to allow people to get safety to the building so that they're not traversing along the car park behind a load of parked cars and so on. Entrances, so many things can go wrong in the design of entrances, but I suppose you've everything from if you've a revolving door, you must provide a complementary accessible door, and that should provide a leading edge of at least 300 millimeters on the pull side of the door, or it should be automated. Door entry systems need to be in accordance with NDA guidance. So I just saw a really good example recently where you had a door entry system which had a hearing induction loop built into it and things like that. But also things like where you have power assisted doors, the location of the access control is really important. So the idea is that if a wheelchair user comes along and presses an access control button to get into a building, they should be able to continue on. And by the time they get to the doors should be fully open. So it's really important that the positioning of the access control is accessible. But as I mentioned earlier on, it's not just about wheelchair access. So you've outward opening doors here. You need to provide barriers and you need to provide cane detection. So what you can't see in that image is that there's a panel of glass in the hazard warning. So you have a cane detection there. Other things like where manual entrance doors are provided, the opening force needs to be less than 30 newtons and so on. That can be an issue when you have wider doors, like 1 meter wide and stuff like that. So you also have issues with various weather conditions when it can be quite windy and so on. So other things getting into the building then, the full height glazed panels. So if you have a glass facade in the front of your building, the doors themselves should be contrast with a different color. So they should be framed a minimum of 25 millimeters. You need to consider your glazed manifestations, as I've already mentioned, dual heights, but also visible in all lighting conditions. The effective clear widths of doors. So again, there's a table, but it's either going to be a meter or 800. Vision panels on doors has already been mentioned by Martin, and internal lobbies need to be designed in accordance with the various diagrams in TGD M 2010. Circulation around buildings. So again, I suppose, look, there's a few examples here, but the design of reception desks, as you know, is covered in under circulation. But you know, a lot of people say, well, no one's going to be making a transaction or no one's going to be signing in here, so we don't need to provide knee recess in our counter and stuff like that. But look, it's really important that when you're looking at the design of reception desks, you look at they're suitable for both standing and seated users. They're provided with the knee recessed. They accommodate staff on the staff side and stuff like that. And 99 times out of 100, the hearing induction loop is never installed. And if it is installed, people don't know how to use it and stuff like that. Lighting in corridors needs to be 100 lux. And then you know, floor finishes need to provide good visual contrast from their surroundings. Here's an example of, you know, it could be a 1200 corridor, but again, it's got obstructions along the width. And here on the floor, it's hard to tell, but we don't know if there's, you know, the change in color maybe perceived as a change of level for someone with a visual impairment. So, you know, you want to be careful when you're designing your floor finishes and your surfaces to make sure that they are accessible for all users. There's two examples, I suppose, that reception areas that are you know, well designed. One thing I would say is there's no signage to indicate that there's hearing induction loops provided in the reception desk. The one on the left, it shows space for 2 wheelchair users to come up to the counter. The one on the right, it's both suitable for both standing and seated users and stuff like that. Allows people to make a transaction and sign in and so on. That's just the text from the section on TGD M around reception desks. Here again, circulation. So the top image is quite a good image in that it shows, like, at the end of the corridor there is a door which with contrast visually from the surrounding. It's got a good vision panel. You can see if you look closely that the actual switches or the controls are contrasting visually in the corridor. The floor and the wall provides good visual contrast, but again, the fire extinguisher isn't recessed and stuff like that. Ironmongery, the orange door with the grey handle, again providing good visual contrast, easy to grip, and so on. Okay, so we've already talked about the full glazed manifestations or full glazed panels internally. Manifestations will be required. Vertical circulation. A few things that can go wrong here. For example, the rise of flight between landings should not exceed 1800 millimeters. So that causes a number of problems particularly in large office developments where you might have a floor to floor of 4 meters, and the people are saying, well, we can get away with it with just making it the rise of flight of 2 meters and so on. Other things like the visual contrasting nosings, making sure that they are correctly designed, but also there's a circular from the RIAI, the Royal Institute of Architects of Ireland, saying that the nosing needs to be on the front of the step, so it can't be offset in 50 mil or anything like that. Handrails, again, you'll find that we always recommend people mount the handrail inside the balustrade rather than on top of the balustrade, because it avoids all the goosenecking and things like that. But it's much easier to design your handrail if it's inside the rail rather than on top of the rail. Again, things like visual contrasting handrails, visual contrasting nosings, the width of the stairs, the width of the landings and things like that can all cause problems. And then things like the handrails extensions of 300 millimeters. Just so everyone's aware, no tactile warnings internally, just externally on steps and so on. Looking at lifts then, so again, we have a European standard on lifts. It's adopted in Ireland. It's ISEN 8170. That's that's a fairly, it means that we can buy a lift in Germany and ship it over to Ireland and install the lift and so on. What we find on projects though is that there are 4 or 5 key elements that are in TGD M that are not covered in the EN 8170. So for example, in TGD M, it recommends that a light color floor finish should be provided. It recommends that the handrail, at least one handrail should visually contrast from the surrounding. The mirror needs to be located 900 to 950 above the finished floor. And you need to provide visually contrasting panels. So you can see the visual contrasting panels here. They contrast from the stainless steel either side. You can see the visual contrasting handrail. You can see the floor as a light color. The light color is to give the perception for someone with a vision impairment that they're not stepping into an empty lift shaft. And then things like the controls and signs on the landings need to be located 500 from corners and stuff like that. So what happens on site is that the lift suppliers will say, well, this is our specification, this is what we're going to install. We would review the specifications and say, well, you need to change your floor finish, you need to change your handrails, you need to change your panels and stuff like that. And they'll always argue that no, it's the lift is EN 8170 compliant, and they don't want to make changes. Okay, so that can become quite a challenge on projects at specification and tender stage and stuff like that. Also, to be aware that the size of the lift for certain types of buildings is 2 meters by 1.4. So that's for particular like theatres and libraries and places like that. So just keep an eye on that one, the design of lifts. Sanitary facilities, what I'd say to people, look, is what can go wrong does go wrong in the fit out and installation of your sanitary facilities. So you take the example that we have here, which is an ambulant disabled cubicle. So in that ambulant disabled cubicle, things that go wrong are the height of the seat needs to be 450 above finished floor levels. You need to have 4 grab rails to either side of the toilet, and they should be positioned, the front of the grab rail should be positioned about 200 millimeters in front of the pan. You need to have 2 coat hooks at different heights. You need to have a pull handle on the inside of the outward opening door. You need to have an easy to use lock. You need to have a colostomy shelf for people using colostomy bags and stuff like that. So in that toilet alone, there's probably 10 or 12 things that can go wrong in relation to Part M. And I challenge everyone as they go home this evening, you're going to stop in a service station or whatever it is along the way. Just have a quick look at the ambulant disabled cubicle and see, is it fitted out in accordance with the diagram of the diagrams in TGD M. These have all been installed. These facilities have all been opened up in the last 8 to 10 years. And I find that no matter which one you go into, none of them seem to have all the grab rails in place and stuff like that. So we have standard cubicles, ambulant cubicles, and large cubicles, accessible WCs. We're now going to have changing places, toilets, and we've got accessible WCs and shower rooms. So I suppose, look, everything that can go wrong does go wrong in the fit out of these places. So, and just one practical example of where we were working on a student accommodation, and there was 2 accessible bedrooms located side by side, and we went into and do an inspection, and the subcontractor was installing the grab rails in both of the accessible WCs and shower rooms. And in that example, he was going into the first toilet, and he was measuring where the grab rails were positioned. He was walking into the next one, and he was actually fitting the grab rails in line with the first toilet he'd done. The problem was the first toilet that was incorrect. So he's basically doubling up on his mistake previously. So I suppose there's a bit of an education piece here about, the importance of the construction drawings being used during the construction itself, but also the fact that people are rushing at the end of these projects to get all the elements put in. They're not actually looking at the specifications and drawings and things like that. So these 2 slides are just highlighting some of the different things that to consider in the design and fit out of your accessible toilets. Martin has sent early on, alarm pull cords, alarm resets, the position of the toilet, the position of the sink, the position of the tap. They all can go easily wrong, and they do go wrong all the time in the fit out of your toilet. So what we do in our office now is we do a benchmark, and so the first accessible toilet that's put into a building, we do a benchmark on that. We work with the contractor to make sure any mistakes that are made in the first toilet aren't replicated in any other toilet and so on. Okay, so again, these are things like the visual and audible fire alarms. The lighting levels need to be 200 to 300 lux. Outward opening doors to be fitted with a horizontal pull handle. So there's just a little checklist for you there to have a look at when you're going out on site doing inspections and so on. And this image is just basically showing you 2 or 3 different toilets. But again, I'm not going to go into the detail here today, but simple things like the shower rail is too close to the corner here. It should be at least 500 and stuff like that. The alarm reset is in the wrong position, and the box outs are incorrectly designed and so on. Okay, so what can go wrong does go wrong here in the fit out of your toilets. Other facilities within the building then includes design of auditoriums. So things like providing space for wheelchair users to sit next to their companion, but also providing seats for 2 wheelchair users to sit next to each other. And it's also important that the detail of the layout of the seating allows the wheelchair user to actually sit next to the seat so they're not too far back and stuff like that. You also have to provide hearing induction loops within your auditoriums, and lift up armrests for, so again, people transferring over and so on. Design of accessible sleeping accommodation. There's a lot of information there, you know, but I suppose it's making sure that the design does meet the diagrams in TGD M, but also that the actual en-suites meets diagram 21 of TGD M. T stations, we've found a lot of problems with T stations, people not providing knee recess, not providing the correct counter heights, not providing the 1800 by 1800 turning areas in front of the T stations and so on. So that's another one to watch out for as well. Last area, aids communication. So it covers signage, visual contrast, lighting, and audible aids. So signage, you know, there's reference to BS 8300 in the section on signage. There's reference to that where you know, directory boards are provided and the signs are low enough to be touched. They need to be tactile and or braille. Here's an example of, I suppose, a well-designed sign. It's got the symbol, it's got the upper and lowercase lettering, it's got the braille indicator and the braille, the text is embossed. It's in Irish and English because under the Official Languages Act, in public bodies have to put Irish and English on their signs, and has to be given equal prominence and stuff like that. I suppose we often find that there's lots of things that can go wrong in the design of signage. So you know, you need to take time to make sure that you actually design the signage to be fully to be correct, but also take on board the sign directories and orientation signs to meet BS 8300 and visual signs to meet BS 8300 and so on. So that includes things like the size of the font, the reading distance, the visual contrast, the use of symbols, and so on. And here's just, this slide is just highlighting everywhere that the TGM recommends that you need to provide accessible signage and within your building. Again, signage can be often left to the end of the project, so it's something that needs a bit of time to get right. Visual contrast. So again, we're talking about light reflectance values. It's a scale of 0 to 100, as you're probably aware. Pure black being 0 and pure white being 100. Ideally, you get 30 points difference in your LRVs. So it's everything from floors to walls to doors to ironmongery to grab rails. Things like your bollards need to be meter in height and fitted with contrasting bands and stuff like that. But just to again, it's something that we're finding more and more people are looking for testing of products, but more and more product developers are putting the LRVs and the color contrast on their products and stuff like that. One thing to watch out for: large repeating patterns should be avoided. So again, for people maybe people with autism, people with vision impairments, it can be very confusing if there are large repeating patterns on floors and walls and stuff like that. That's just an example of how to measure LRVs. There is a British standard, BS 4800, which is a good color chart. If you Google that, you get all the different colors on the British standard. And think about this, for example, coffee and Irish green. There's only 12 points difference between those two colors. So you might have thought there was good visual contrast, but it's measured on a grayscale. So just be careful that you might think two colors contrast, but it's measured on a grayscale. So just have a look at the BS 4800 color chart there as well. This slide is just highlighting is generally 30 points or more. Large areas such as walls and floor can be 20 points or more, and door opening furniture against the background 15 points or more. So that's just some information on visual contrast. Lighting, again, and maybe just for discussion later on, is that, you know, TGD M specifies different lighting levels for both externally and internally within buildings. For example, 100 lux in corridors, 100 lux in stairs, and 200 to 300 lux in toilets. But also it specifies between 20 and 100 lux externally. There's been a lot of research done in the UK by CIBSE in relation to lighting levels externally on approaches to buildings, and the lighting levels are much lower in relation to the external environment approach. So it might be just worth considering that there are different lighting levels that are being specified now, because there's issues with people with visual impairments going from a really bright area into a street level where the lighting levels could be 4 to 5 lux and things like that. So those two slides are just highlighting some stuff on lighting, and it gives you the different lux levels of where the lighting requirements are. Last area is hearing enhancement systems. 3 areas where you must provide hearing enhancement systems: in your reception area, in your main foyer, in your induction couplers in your lifts, and the third area is audience and spectator facilities with and without fixed seating. So your lecture theatres and maybe your PE hall in the school but that's used as for the Christmas play and stuff like that. So just the three areas: the reception, the lift, and the audience and spectator facilities. So I suppose just to conclude, I would just say to people, accessibility is a key factor in nearly every element of a design. So whether that's working with the landscape architect or whether it's working with the M&E consultants on alarms in toilets and things like that. I also highly recommend that, for architects or engineers or agents, that a detailed review of accessibility criteria takes place at tender stage, because you're getting into the specifications then. So you've done your DAC application, you've said that your toilet's going to be X, Y, and Z. You're now looking at the detail, and you need to make sure you get the detail right. Suppliers and contractors need to be aware of their obligations. So again, there's an education piece for the contractors and suppliers that needs to be looked at. Access issues on major projects happen towards the end. That's when everyone is rushing. That's when things are going to go wrong easily. The devil's in the details. There's so much things that can go wrong in relation to accessibility, particularly, the small detail like the position of the alarm reset or the alarm pull cord and stuff like that. Universal design versus Part M compliance. So I suppose, Part M Part M is the regulations. Technical guidance document is the minimum guidance to comply with the regulations. There is also universal design, which goes beyond the guidance in TGD M, and for larger projects like leisure centres or libraries and various projects you might be working on, a universal design approach would be recommended. And then just finally to say that there is a code of practice coming out on the Disability Act. There is an obligation on the public sector to make the public areas of their public buildings accessible and keep them in line with the requirements of Part M. So we have a new Part M coming out, so there's going to be 10 years of a lead in for people to meet the new requirements of Part M. So thanks very much for your time.